When it comes to video game difficulty, they say a bad gamer blames his controllers, although I don't seem to be getting very far with this one. Hello everybody, welcome to the ReReview, the series where I get to replay and reassess games from my favourite gaming era. I'm Brian, also known as UK Gen Zoidberg, and even though it's 2024, I probably still like to play Amiga games more than anything else. You may know me from my time as a writer on both Cardiaxx and Amiga Action, and while many of the games that I reviewed during this time were well-known releases that are still remembered by everybody today, there were also those games that didn't make much of an impact first time around. Does this mean that they're a hidden gem that just happened to be overshadowed by a more high-profile release? Or maybe they were in a crowded genre where it was difficult to stand out? Or perhaps it was just because they were an unmemorable title not really deserving of your attention? Join me as we find out which one of those three categories today's game falls into. The game that we're going to be talking about is the scrolling shooter Cardiaxx, which was released by Electronic Zoo and developed by Eclipse Design in early 1992. Regular viewers of this series will know that I like to use this section of the video to delve into the history of the game and find out all about the people who made it. In this case, finding out information about the team behind Cardiaxx proved to be incredibly difficult, as it turned out that this was the only game that Eclipse Design ever made. And I also found out that they should not be confused with Eclipse Software Design from Germany, makers of Monster Business and the Amiga version of The Last Ninja. It was also published by Electronic Zoo, and finding out information about them proved to be equally tricky. Electronic Zoo published a number of games for the Amiga across multiple genres in just a very short lifespan. Their first two games, both of which arrived in 1989, included the underwater isometric platformer Treasure Trap, a game which I enjoyed immensely. And that was swiftly followed by Enterprise's Battle Squadron, a game which is arguably the best scrolling shooter on the Amiga. I'd argue that it is, but that's actually a discussion for another time. Next month's episode of Retro Game Super League, in fact. Amongst their most well-known releases was the fantasy RPG Abandoned Places, which came from Hungarian developer ArtGame. While this was not my kind of game at all, I can remember it being a big hit with fantasy role-playing fans. They were also the UK publisher for Lariciel's Tennis Cup, which at the time of its release was the best tennis game available for the Amiga. In Games X issue 22 from September 1991, Jason Spiller, our Southern news editor, actually visited the offices of Electronic Zoo in order to conduct an interview with the makers of an upcoming game called The Magic Garden, a game which I actually reviewed when it came out. The publisher had actually just sent out hundreds of fully ceramic garden gnomes to all the gaming press in order to promote the game. Cardiaxx possibly ended up being the final game released by Electronic Zoo as, according to the game's programmer, Joseph Carthauser, the company actually went bankrupt just weeks after the final game was delivered, and they received no payment. For almost all of the team that worked on the game, including fellow programmer Dave Mariner, as well as artists John Mitchell and James Upright, this would be their only credit. Carthauser left gaming altogether and has gone on to have a very successful and prolific career in the business side of computing. According to the back of the box, Cardiaxx claimed to be the fastest shooter ever made, accompanied by a mammoth rock soundtrack. That soundtrack was composed by Matthew Simmons, a veteran of many Amiga games, including Agony, Leander, and Micro Machines. The story of Cardiaxx doesn't end there though. Like many Amiga games, it was subject to a budget re-release a couple of years later. For this release, it was snapped up by Team 17, a publisher well renowned for releasing revised editions of games on the budget label. For Cardiaxx, they made a few minor tweaks to the game's difficulty and speed, as well as doubled the number of levels from 4 to 8. If you're downloading the game to try and play it on your A500 Mini, there are many places where you can do so, including My Abandonware and Dream 17, but please be aware that there are multiple versions of the game, so you never know which one you're going to end up playing. It was the original 1992 release that I reviewed though, so now it's time to go back and see what I said about it at the time. My review appeared in the Christmas 1991 issue of Games X, alongside my reviews of both Tip-Off from Anko and Monkey Island 2, the latter of which I have previously covered on the ReReview way back in episode 6. Being the Christmas issue, this meant that the number of pages was increased from the normal 48 to a bumper 64, packed with more reviews, news, tips, players' guides and previews than ever before. How we got it all done in a week, I'll never know. It takes me 2 weeks to make one of these videos. I stated that the game that Cardiaxx reminded me of the most was Iridium, which I had played on the Commodore 64 and Spectrum, and the sequel to which was still 2 years out on the Amiga at this point. I also pointed out that the game was incredibly tough. I didn't argue with the claim on the box about this being the fastest shooter around, and I also pointed out that it remained incredibly smooth even at its fastest. I did, however, question the claim about the music. The tunes are excellent, although I'm not too sure about the mammoth rock soundtrack promised on the box. Sure, there are guitars and stuff, but Metallica, it certainly is not. It seems I had good taste in music way back then as well. I awarded it 4 X's out of 5 overall, with presentation scoring 15 out of 20 and both gameplay and lastability scoring 1 point less at 14 out of 20. Here's how my score compares to the ones that appears in other Amiga magazines. Now let's boot the game up and see how it plays today. It's time for the playtest. It's not the most exciting or spectacular intro sequence that I've ever seen, but I think it doesn't feel out of place, and it sets the graphical style for the game quite nicely. Not really sure that games of this type really require that much of a story though. So here we go, there is no options screen. This is the original Electronic Zoo release from 1992 that I have downloaded to play here. So let's get straight into level 1. I think the graphics are not the best that you've ever seen, but they do the job and they are very smooth. Which for a game that's as fast as this one, smoothness is probably the most important thing. As you can see, I have played this a little bit, so I do actually know where the enemies are coming from. Damn it, didn't want to die then. It's not a hugely sophisticated shooter by any stretch of the imagination. Oh, and game over already. Oh, ran out of time. Now I think unless you've got a really good trigger finger, an auto fire is almost essential for this game. So it is a bit of a shame that the game doesn't have one built in. Because if you're trying to play this on the A500 Mini, then you are going to be hammering that button really quickly and a lot. And the game does automatically give you extra weapon power or extra time just by destroying waves of enemies. Ultimately, I think the simplicity actually goes against the game a little bit. And in case you're wondering, that giant score in the middle of the screen is something that you can actually turn off. But it's not something that the manual actually tells you though, which is an odd one. And so that's the end of level 1 already. Can I do this without dying? Yay! Did it without dying. Brilliant. And so then you get the deep space bonus level, where you can't change direction, you are just flying in one direction. You can actually get bonus time and power-ups by killing all the enemies on this. And extra life. Yes, I just got an extra life. The speech is really nice. It was a really nice touch. Because the actual on-screen arrow that tells you what direction enemies are coming from is not very big at all, so by actually having the speech tell you that enemies are approaching from the left or the right, it means that you don't have to actually look at the hood, which is always nice. And so we'll move on to level 2. The longer you can keep your power-ups for, the better, really. Go on, open. Oh, I ran out of time. I think the time limits are one of the worst things about the game, really. They are extremely tight. There's also no level codes, so you're thrown right back to start level 1 again every time you die. So you see, if you press the spacebar, that will get rid of the score behind me and make the game look a little bit nicer. A little less distracting. There's a little bit more... The game is a little bit too regimented in its approach to everything. And I think it would actually be better if you had a little bit more freedom to do things. And what would go a long way towards that is if you actually had to pick up power-ups that waves of enemies dropped. So rather than the game just automatically giving you extra time or extra power, if you actually had to pick up an on-screen power pill in order to do that, then there would be an element of randomness to everything, which would really improve the game quite a lot. And while we're on the subject of power-ups that give you extra time, dishing out more of them would certainly be a lot better as well, because, as I said before, the time limits are extremely strict. I think the differences between this original release and the budget re-release from Team 17 are actually pretty minimal. The average man on the street would not notice, because probably wouldn't get very far enough into the game to actually notice. It is definitely one of those games that gets better the more you play it, because you do start to learn the attack patterns a little bit better, but there's going to be a lot of people who are going to find this ridiculously hard from the moment they load it up. There's probably not an awful lot of variety to the enemy types either. Because as you can see, I've killed that enemy many times on the first level. I'll try and avoid these asteroids. Oh, game over again. But I don't think there's much else to actually show you from this game. So that's probably going to be the end of the playtest for this edition. Let's get on to the re-review and summarise my thoughts.
As long as there are video games, there will always be bold claims made by the people who make them. In the case of Cardiaxx, claiming that it's the fastest shooter ever made is definitely true, but it's actually to the detriment of the game. It's almost as if they decided to make it as fast as possible without stopping to think, does this make the game fun? Okay, that's probably a little bit harsh of me, as there is definitely some fun to be had when you play this game. It's just a shame that these little things keep getting in the way of that fun. There's the excruciating level of difficulty for starters. Start up your first game and I guarantee that you will have lost all 3 of your lives in less than a minute. Play a few more times and you'll start to learn the enemy attack patterns and get to grips with the controls, and then just as you're starting to enjoy yourself again, you'll fall victim to the extremely tight time limit and get a game over message on the screen. Many players will also find it nigh on impossible to achieve the required rate of fire without an auto-fire joystick. The zip stick was ideal in this regard, and probably would have been the controller that I used when I originally reviewed it. If you're going to be playing it on the A500 Mini or through an emulator though, you're going to have no such luxury, and you really are going to have to try and limber up that trigger finger before you start. I like a challenging game as much as the next person, but only if that challenge is actually a fair one. Because of the tight time limits in Cardiaxx, there's ultimately no room for improvisation from the player, and that ends up dragging the game down. There are definitely worse side-scrolling shooters on the Amiga than Cardiaxx, and that's reflected by its position in the Retro Game Super Leagues, but that doesn't stop it from being a disappointment. My original 4-star review was almost certainly too high, and I'll be giving it 6 out of 10 today. Thank you for watching this episode of the ReReview. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you have any memories of playing Cardiaxx back in the day, I'd love to hear what you thought of it in the comments. Please remember, all opinions expressed in this video are entirely mine and not those of the UK Gaming Network team. If you're new to the channel, then you can find all previous episodes in this series in a handy playlist, and the link to that probably should be on screen about now. Why not check out the Retro Game Super Leagues as well while you're at it? If you enjoy these videos, please remember to give us a like and subscribe to show your support for what we do and to make sure that you don't miss out on the next one. VIP members on the channel actually get to watch these videos early, as well as get to have their say in what games we cover, and it costs just $1.99 a month. The link to the membership offer should be in the video description. Please do check it out. In 2 weeks it's going to be time for the next of our Members' Choice videos, so please do come back then to find out what I'm going to be playing. Until then, happy retro gaming, bye for now.